Welcome to Joining the Dots. I'm Thomas Strowan, your host. This podcast explores real-life insights from those dedicated to pursuing justice, reducing harm, and enhancing global security. As co-founder of Clue Software and a technologist, I collaborate daily with diverse teams tackling some of the most pervasive problems in the world, ranging from child abuse to human trafficking, organised crime, fraud, and much more. In Joining the Dots, I speak with those deeply entrenched in these worlds. The victims, the perpetrators, the investigators, the leaders, the techies, the academics. The often unsung heroes on the front line, working to tirelessly create a safer world. Welcome to Joining the Dots. Welcome to another edition of Joining the Dots. Today I'm delighted to say we're at Portsmouth University. My second time here in the last few years. Portsmouth is widely respected for its criminology research, and I can demonstrate that because even through my sort of commercial network, I know quite a lot of people who have links with the university, which must be some indicator of success, for sure. My guest today is Professor Mark Button, a leading authority on cybercrime and economic crime. He's a director of the Centre of Cybercrime and Economic Crime here at the university. Today we'll be taking an international lens to fraud and cybercrime. If you're a criminal looking to make money, why risk robbing a bank when you can conduct fraud online from the comfort of your home? Logically, why would you reside in the same jurisdiction as your victim when you could be somewhere much, much more inaccessible abroad? And then overlay technology that can facilitate this, whether it's creating this borderless digital world that we live in or creating the tools that enable fraud to happen at such an unprecedented scale. So Mark has been at the forefront of understanding this ever-evolving landscape for many years. Most recently, he's turned his attention to the world of West African scam culture, offering unique insights into this pretty incredible area of fraud, what's driving it and what we can do to stop it. So first of all, Mark, thank you for joining us.
No problem. Great to be here.
Great. So Mark, can I kick off by asking briefly a bit of background? What got you into this and what keeps you in it?
Okay. So my interests started with non-state policing, particularly private security. And you might think that sounds rather strange of how you go from that to fraud. But as I was researching non-state policing and private security, it became very clear that most fraud is investigated by non-state bodies. If you have fraud on your credit card, who investigates it? It's the bank. If there's an insurance fraud, it's an insurer. So there's a substantial body of private policing, and also non-police policing through specialist statutory bodies and other sort of NGOs, particularly in if you take, sports corruption and areas like that, which are private or hybrid. So I got very, very interested in this area and just became more and more attracted to it. And that just led to lots of opportunities to research different aspects of it. And early on, I received a lot of research money to look at victims of fraud. And then I'd expanded. I did some studies that looked at the offenders. Then I looked at different ways to prevent and deal with it. And so, today I regard my main interests as economic crime and in particular fraud and cybercrime. Yeah. So that's really how I got to where I am today.
I saw on your LinkedIn profile that you went through an academic route. You went to LSE and then onwards from there. At what point did you go, I think it's fraud, economic crime, criminology? When did you sort of make that decision? And I suppose to add to that, we'll have listeners who are considering either going into academia, which has links to criminology, or they might be considering exiting academia and going into investigations and things. So I suppose what made you stay in academia and perhaps not cross over the fence to tackling it in a sort of either statutory or non-statutory way, as you allude to?
Well, I'd say the turning point for my interest in fraud was probably the mid-noughties. And I became particularly interested at that point in kind of non-state and hybrid policing bodies looking at fraud in the public sector. And I realized then that this was a really interesting and fascinating area. And that was really, I would say, the turning point. I think, my career is slightly mixed compared to a normal academic in the sense that, I left university, I worked for a member of parliament.
Right.
I was researching home affairs related issues with him, in particular private security and private security regulation. And probably at that point in my life, I probably wanted to be a member of parliament. That was my sort of ambition. But the MP I worked for, he had also been an academic, and he basically told me that, the best for me would be to do exactly as him and, go and become a lecturer and then become a member of parliament from that. So I did do that, and I got a job here in Portsmouth. But I suppose I came to really love this job and the diversity. I'm always researching new, different issues. I get up in the morning and I want to go to work, rush along and, do some more research. There's always something new and interesting. I've got lots of interesting projects on the go at the moment, and they keep me very excited and very interested. So, and I can still help organizations and governments better deal with this problem through my writings and through, the advice and support that I give. And I do a lot of work with particularly the Home Office and other key government bodies to advise them on, the best way to tackle fraud.
Oh, okay. That's really interesting. You are our first person on the podcast with an academic sort of background career. Primarily, I tell you, you've got other things going on. So that's really interesting to me for sure. Okay, so should we get a bit towards subject matter then? Mm-hmm. You mentioned you're involved in lots of interesting projects, but I think one of the ones that we spoke about and that piqued our interest, particularly on the international fraud side, was this sort of West African fraud challenge. Perhaps you might want to start by just kicking us off with what is it, and a bit of a background to it.
Yeah, sure. So obviously everyone out there is familiar with Nigeria as a major country for exporting fraud, shall we say. That's a very kind of common perception. And obviously there is a lot of reality to that. They're not the only country. There are many other countries with lots of fraud, and we'll maybe come to those a bit later. So I've been interested in the fraudsters themselves and the techniques and what they do. And we were lucky enough to win a research project ultimately funded by the Home Office to look at fraud in West Africa, so Nigeria and Ghana, as well as India. And so we did quite a rapid but deep study where we interviewed a wide range of actors, including the fraudsters themselves, the law enforcement investigating them.
And how did that come about? The sort of that you jumped on that and did that, just out of interest?
Well, it was also a contract that the Home Office wanted.
Right. So the Home Office can see the challenge, they can see what's happening, and they're going, right, how do we tackle this? Right, we need to go to our network, academia, etc.
Yeah.
We need to go and find out more. And then, you put your hand up and go, right, this is one that's for us.
Yes, and we bid for it and won it, and that's how it came about. So it's quite a significant project. It is published. If you go to my profile website, you'll find the study there, and we're publishing a series of papers that build upon that. In addition to that, I've done a lot of work with a former PhD student of mine, Solomon Lazarus. He passed his PhD with me about 5 or 6 years ago, but he's originally from Nigeria. He's done a lot of research, and we've worked together on various projects on Nigerian fraudsters to kind of get a deeper understanding of them. So all of those projects together have kind of built up a substantial body of knowledge on the scale, the nature, and the types of frauds all emanating from West Africa.
I think I've got some experience of this in the sense that we have some customers who have operations in Nigeria. And I know that's just one example of many. But I think what was interesting to me was the culture. This counter fraud operation would be enforcing, in this case, UK rules to their Nigerian organization. For example, it's quite common, and this is at a very ground level, but it's quite common to, you might call it tipping, but you might actually call it, you're in a hotel and you give money to certain individuals within the hotel to enable you to have dinner, to meet, have meetings, do all this sort of stuff. So facilitators, which is just common, a very standard cultural thing in some countries, but to which, is part of this whole potentially fraudulent corruption ecosystem that we might define it. Yes. So is there a lot of that in this, in terms of how it's come about and why these countries are so at the forefront of this?
Yeah, well, I think there's a whole series of factors why Nigeria is a major hub of fraud, and obviously also corruption in its kind of, senior echelons of society. But, it boils down to a number of key factors. So first of all, if we're looking at frauds that targets UK, America, many other countries, the major factors that are driving that is, first of all, you have a large population of very skilled in IT males, because it is largely males, who don't have legitimate opportunities to work in the IT world, or all the kinds of things are normal that would happen in the UK or America. So you've got that skilled population with no significant opportunities for the kind of, if you like, the real work. You've then got a culture that has built up, and if you go back 20 odd years, people will be familiar with the internet cafes and the so-called Yahoo boys, and some of those were very successful and they made lots of money, and they became role models. And
so just to be clear, this is sort of groups of people in an internet cafe, as I can still remember them, collaborating effectively, sharing insight,
working together, sometimes generally all individually, but sharing information and skills and know-how amongst each other on how to do the fraud. But obviously, some of those are very successful and they became very wealthy, and they became role models. Mm-hmm. So you've now got individuals who are skilled, going to universities, struggling to get real opportunities, seeing individuals making money, and then start to overlay on top of that another layer where you've got a very corrupt government. And you've got very senior politicians and very senior administrators who are basically, looting the public resources for their own benefit. And they look at that and they think to themselves, and justify to themselves, well, they're stealing from us, from the government. We're actually just stealing from those people abroad, not from, our own citizens. What's wrong with it? They use that as a kind of justification, whether that's right or wrong.
Yeah.
So you get that overlaid on it. And then the other aspect to this is you've got very little deterrence and enforcement. Now, that's started to change a bit, particularly in Nigeria in recent years, but historically, for a long period of time, there was very little chance of anything bad, happening to these individuals getting involved. So you start to kind of link all those things together. You think to yourself, you're a skilled individual in a country where the odds are against you in terms of making a legitimate living, but you can go online and you can scam and you can make a significant sum of money, and then you can have the riches, you can have the nice house, the nice car, the very nice lifestyle. You start to kind of overlay that and kind of look into their minds, their rationalization, you can see why many of them engage in these activities. So what you have now is in certain sections of Nigeria, particularly the south of Nigeria, it's not so strong in the north, which is predominantly Muslim, but certainly in the south, in the large urban areas, you have sort of communities that on a kind of communal level tolerate fraud. They don't see anything wrong with it. And then you've got a kind of hardcore that actively engage in it. And because of the success of some and because of that tolerance, you've got families that see nothing wrong with their children, becoming fraudsters. And even you have now, families encouraging their children to go into fraud into some of these areas. And we've had the emergence of what's become known as the hustle kingdom, which is essentially a school for fraudsters, where, a family signs their child up to these hustle kingdoms, and they're trained in, the art of fraud, working for a chairman of these schools, and with the aim of once they finish school, they will be skilled fraudsters capable of working on.
Right. Okay, and what are let's get a bit specific on the types of fraud. I mean, they're getting trained up on these things. What are the common types of fraudulent activity that these organizations are doing?
Yeah, there's a wide range of different frauds. So everyone will probably be aware of the romance fraud. That's very, very, very common. The fraudsters will impersonate males or females on dating apps, dating websites, social media, build up a relationship to try and obviously get to a stage where they can then get money out of that individual. It's a romance fraud.
I mean, that's quite sophisticated, is I suppose what I'm getting at with romance fraud. Because, you've got to have the right language, you've got to have the right, way to build up relationships and to, enable the opt-out so that the victim feels as if they are in a position of trust. Typically, I associate romance fraud with almost like, a combination of in-person and online, because that's how you can really sort of get that. It's just the skill of doing that from an office room in southern Nigeria, I suppose, with the tools they have available, because, Gen AI and things can really help people's local dialectic language when it's written and all that sort of stuff. I mean, is it that sophisticated? Or is it more of a numbers game, maybe?
Some will be very, should we say, basic romance fraudsters who aren't probably that effective, who might make, a few $1,000s, here and there. But some will be very, very effective. Some will also work as teams. So they might have different individuals working on different aspects of the romance. They might turn to web developers to help them develop, fake banking websites and, other relevant documents and things like that to kind of deceive the victim. Mm-hmm. So some are very sophisticated, some much more basic. They vary, quite significantly. But romance is obviously a big part of fraud there. Another big area of fraud is business email compromise fraud.
Yep.
This is not sort of like sophisticated hacking like you might get with, say, the Russian gangs and former, Soviet Union. It's often rooted in, first of all, basic phishing, maybe more targeted spear phishing and those types of things, where they will seek to get information on how to get into a system. And then once they've secured that through the phishing, they'll then monitor that system and look for an opportunity for a fraud. So the most common is obviously some kind of invoice that's going to be paid, and they will kind of log into the system and try and get the banking details changed or something like that. Or they'll impersonate a company and send, further invoices and things like that. So they get into the system that way. So business email compromise fraud is another area that tends to be some of the more sophisticated gangs, because you can imagine that particularly, when you're dealing with a lot of companies' own internal systems to protect themselves, it is quite a difficult one to kind of, crack into. But if you look at some of the cases where they have been busted and extradited to America, some of them have got tens, hundreds of millions of dollars, from these types of scams.
I think it's just that also what's sort of quite scary is the level of sophistication, because it's quite easy to think back 3 or 4 years when you'd get some very amateur email from, claiming to be some sort of, Nigerian royalty with a great deal of inheritance that they can magically pass your way. It's easy to sort of think of it in those terms, but in fact, the world has changed so much. I've certainly seen it. I saw a video on LinkedIn the other day, and it showed, I can't remember the celebrity, but basically the prompt to the Gen AI was, show this celebrity eating a bowl of spaghetti. And 2 years ago, it was awful. Oh, it was Will Smith. There you go. Will Smith eating. I don't know who to credit that to, but you could just tell it was so. You could just tell it was a low quality. Fast forward to today, and I was looking at it thinking, I can only just tell if I was really concentrating that's AI.
Yes.
So you apply that just to the typical Nigerian scam process, and all of a sudden it's just 10 times better.
Yes, and they're already using AI in a lot of the areas, obviously not least in terms of the romance frauds, by creating pictures of people. They don't have to search the internet and find an image which could potentially be found by a potential victim, expose them. They're using AI to rewrite their language, a common, and I think still advocated today, a good way to detect a scam is look at the language. There'll be mistakes in the grammar, etc. These days, you just put it into ChatGPT and it rewrites it for you perfectly. So that's like, changing the voice, the whole range of different areas where they're using that AI, and they tend to be ahead of us, if you like, the good guys, because they're innovative, they're at the cutting edge, and he's looking for new opportunities. So yeah, all of that.
I think that the thing that I certainly see from my standpoint is an increasing level of sophistication around how convincing the whole thing is, whether it be the romance fraud, whether it be the business related fraud. But also the other aspect is that it's the volume at which they'll do it. If you're 3 or 4 years ago, you might be a fraudster and you might target, I don't know, 50 organizations in a week or a day, or I don't know the metrics exactly. And you might hope that one, might with a bit of luck, go, okay, I'll enter this process, and then you might get a fallout rate of whatever. So you can figure the sums out of this sort of pipeline, if you like. But it just exponentially increases, and I think that I'm assuming that a lot of the sort of the West African groups have really nailed this, which is actually, rather than targeting 50, let's target 50 million. Let's have that let's have the professional sort of approach, but let's just go for the numbers game as well, and let's have the technology stack that can support that and automate it. So they're just doing some really clever stuff around that, as well as impersonation. So it's just like, what a win-win, and they're in a jurisdiction where it's very difficult to sort of go and catch them, if you like.
Absolutely, they've got access to this technology, and they've got those factors we discussed earlier that make it much easier. So yeah, it's a no-brainer. Another common one is obviously the crypto investments. That's another common one that emanates from Nigeria and again, other countries. Obviously, if you were lucky enough to be in Bitcoin at the start, you'd be a very rich person now. But obviously that's not the reality now for most, cryptocurrencies. But lots of people are open to the idea that you can make a lot of money investing in cryptocurrencies. So there's a very wide range of scams, operating around crypto from, sort of fake cryptocurrencies to, scams that kind of seek to basically steal, real cryptocurrency that you may purchase or have. So there's a wide range of scams around crypto and other kind of related investments. And another wide range of scams that I've seen that come from Nigeria are just sort of basic kinds of, if you like, consumer services type frauds. So let's say, for instance, I saw one recently of this, and you're broken down on a road in America, and you want to phone a breakdown truck, and you go onto your Google on your phone, you find top rated on Google, get the number, phone them up, and arrange and pay for a breakdown truck. And then it never arrives. It's just a kind of fake website. And there's lots of, I think, consumer products like that scam, and again, not just Nigeria. They set up some fake company selling something, some kind of service, and make sure it gets to the top of the kind of search lists.
Clear.
And then when you purchase them, they don't exist. So there are lots and lots of scams like that. So those are probably the most common types of scams you get on there. There are others that we could go on for ages, but those would be the most common.
Yeah, and I guess I don't know whether this is true, but we talk about larger and larger organisations that are undertaking this activity. I assume they're also building up is some corporate intelligence. So what I mean by that is, back to our analogy of targeting 50 million, blanket target 50 million potential victims and hope to get 0.1% of it, or whatever those metrics are. If you're doing that quite frequently, you're going to build up a lot of understanding about what those 0.1 percentages are. And you're going to start to go, well, okay, these 1,000 people in that 50 million blanket thing, they didn't fall for it. But there was a couple of times where we got through a bit of their initial, detection. So let's put those into this bucket over here, along with, the 1,000 others from these other 5 scams that we're running.
Yeah.
And let's go, well, these exhibited similar vulnerability conditions. So we're going to target them with another type of fraud, which we think will be more successful.
Yes.
So it's just like developing a corporate engine out of entrepreneurialism, which is scary in itself.
Yes.
Around fraud, which is what they seem to be doing.
Yes. No, absolutely. They've got loads of knowledge, and they do share that knowledge, and they do sell that knowledge. There are lists, they're kind of very horribly called suckers lists that are traded of people that are, likely to become victims to certain types of scams. But also they use legitimate business techniques as well, so, cryptocurrency investments, if you were a legitimate cryptocurrency investment company, you can go to organizations and buy marketing lists of people that are more likely to buy those types of things. And they do exactly the same. So they use the kind of legitimate, data brokers as well as, the illegitimate. So they're very sophisticated in doing some of those things.
So before we go to some ideas in terms of how this should be tackled, perhaps we could just talk about, you mentioned before about hundreds of millions of pounds worth of some of these individuals and organizations are generating. Well, what's the bigger picture on this in terms of the value that they're defrauding from people? And I suppose more importantly, what's the impact on the victims that you're seeing and observing?
Well, it's very hard to judge the cost globally of fraud, but if we just take Southeast Asian scam compounds, they've been estimated to generate, 30, 40, $50 billion of income, per year.
Which is the kind of income that would put you nicely into the S&P 500.
Absolutely. And in Nigeria, I'm sure it would amount to billions and billions of dollars, the whole, kind of fraud and scam economy. So it's very, very big business. You obviously do have a mix of size of organizations in Nigeria, from loaners to kind of small groups to kind of, what you'd regard as medium-sized enterprises. And then we haven't mentioned so far, the confraternities like Black Axe, which are kind of more debatable on how deep and how well organized and how much they're involved in fraud. But there's no doubt that Black Axe is a major organized crime organization in Italy, involved in, trafficking of women for prostitution, for drugs, etc. And I think there's a lot of emerging evidence that Black Axe is a major player in fraud, in different parts of the world. Now, Black Axe is a very large organization. It has, millions of members. Because once you join it at university, you're signing up for life. It has very sophisticated organizational structures. It has zones. So, when you look at it, some of those organizations, they're huge. So you have got, quite a mix of different types of organizations out there, and some, generating a great deal of money.
I shall have to read up about Black Axe. I haven't come across them, but sounds very scary. Okay. What about just briefly about the sort of the impact to victims of the increasing impact as a result of this sort of growing level of fraud and cybercrime?
There's often this term that's used that fraud is victimless, because a lot of victims get their money back. But I think that is very, very false, because even victims who get their money back, suffer a lot of traumas. It knocks their confidence. They get anxious. Some has an impact on their health. So you've got a wide range of different types of impacts. There have been lots of examples of fraud, victims of fraud who have committed suicides, such as being the impact. So it does have a kind of major impact. But it also knocks confidence in lots of institutions and things that we should have confidence in. So if you've, responded to an email and that has led to you becoming a victim of fraud, a lot of people become less confident in using email. If you bought something online that hasn't turned up because it was a fraudulent company, you don't buy things. If someone's accessed your online banking, you're reluctant. So it undermines a lot of things in society, which are obviously, particularly in the digital age, very, very important.
Yeah, I mean, I don't, whenever I get a text from purporting to be from a delivery service, I assume it's fraudulent, rightly or wrongly. Often when I just get calls, I don't have there's just a number. 50% of the time it might be, a sales call or something, but often it's a fraudulent call, so I don't answer my phone for it to run. I mean, if they want to get hold of me, they can leave a voicemail. I know those are really superficial examples from me, but you can imagine how that kind of compounds to make a big effect.
It does have a huge effect on society. Same as you. I mean, we have a landline in my home, but we don't plug it in because, the only calls we get on our landline are from either fraudsters or people trying to sell you something. As part of our contract, we have to have a landline, so just don't plug it in. Family and friends can get a hold of you on your mobile, and you can obviously see who's phoning you on your mobile as well, and kind of vet it that way. So yeah, there is a kind of, and it's one of the things I've been interested actually, which I haven't done yet, to try and gauge what is the cost to society of all of those things when you start to add them up. I think it's quite significant.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and if you do get the answer to that, then I'd be delighted to understand more about it. But okay, so let's move on to sort of tackling this. I think one of the latest stats, and you'll be able to, I'm sure you'll be able to tell me where this came from, is that 70% odd of fraud and cybercrime, it has an international element to it. How do we tackle it? How are we tackling it? And how do we better tackle it? Because it clearly isn't working at the moment.
Yes. Well, that's the Home Office figure, and they don't offer much detail, but I would say it's probably a fair estimate, that it's clear the vast majority of fraud has an international element, and it comes from, West Africa, India, Southeast Asia, those common areas.
And so 70%, and it's like 220 billion in the UK, we estimate. Is that a number that you recognise? Yeah,
that's 220, but that also includes businesses.
Oh, okay.
So that's a kind of much, but it's a significant sum.
Yeah.
So how do we deal with it? That's, well, first of all, obviously, where you've got countries like, Nigeria and India, where there are large numbers of active fraudsters, and they're not just obviously targeting the UK, they're targeting America, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, etc. The key is to work with those other countries together. And there's a bit of that happening, but not a lot. And then to work with law enforcement in those countries to get them to take fraud much more seriously. Now, I think to be fair to Nigeria, they have done a great deal of that. They have the Economic and Financial Crimes Commission. If you go to their website, they prosecute about 4,000 people a year for fraud-related offences.
Yeah.
That's
of 180 million people.
It's not enough. But it's probably
not all. Yeah.
They're doing a lot more than probably our police are doing against fraudsters that are based in our country.
Yeah.
So they are doing a lot, but not enough. And they're doing so much actually. A lot of Nigerian fraudsters are moving to Ghana and other countries where there's less hassle and risk of actually getting a visit from law enforcement. But that's only kind of part of what can be done, because the trouble with criminal prosecutions are that they're very labour intensive and costly, and particularly when you throw in the international dimension and the evidence gathering and all of those things. It's very, very...
you can't lock everyone up, is the...
No, exactly. So I think there's two other sides to kind of deal with it. One side is prevention. So you've got to do much, much more to equip individuals in the UK, about the UK, but obviously other countries as well, not to become victims. You've got to give them the knowledge, the awareness of what scams are happening, and give them, the knowledge and the tools and the products, an increasingly wide range of products available to help people from becoming victims of fraud, to kind of reduce that victimization. So take things like call blockers, or activating, apps on your mobile phone that identify a telephone call as fraudulent, or a text message or email, etc. So there's a lot that can be done there, and and the government has been trying to push a lot, and we're probably ahead of the game compared to some countries in terms of that, but still a lot more that could be done.
Yeah, because we are quite a mature digital sort of country, aren't we? Well, ahead of some other developed nations.
Yeah, I mean, we're much further ahead than America. If you look at the comparison of fraud victimization rates, America's top, and they have even bigger problems than we do because of the multiple, jurisdictions in the states and different law enforcement. the banks are kind of much more, reluctant to get involved, whereas obviously we've had the banking charge and things like that. So we've been doing a lot on prevention. We could still do more, but I think, in comparison to other countries, we're definitely ahead of the game. But I think the third very important area is disruption. And this is a kind of alternative to criminal prosecution. So I think so if we take the Mr. Bigs, and I say Mr. because they generally are male, then I think if you can't get them through a criminal prosecution, there's a lot of evidence out there of who these individuals are. You can use alternatives like sanctions. So you can, freeze their assets. They've got assets in other countries. You can do travel bans and things like that. And then, it's up for them to come to the table with evidence to prove they're not fraudsters. Yeah. So those sanctions are very important. And then, but the other aspect of disruption, which I think is where most law enforcement is miles and miles behind, is disruption. And if you watch scam baiters on YouTube, which, I do a great deal of, and I'm doing a little study of scam baiters, they do all kinds of interesting things to the fraudsters to disrupt them. And obviously they do it largely for entertainment purposes, but it's a kind of model. So take, for instance, someone like Jim Browning, very, very famous, and he deals with largely Indian fraudsters, but there are scam baiters that focus on other countries, including Nigeria. A scammer phones him up, or he phones them, depending on what type of scam it is, and then they try to take over his computer through, the means of the scam, and then he effectively hacks their computer.
Yeah.
And then, if you look at some of the things he's done, he's, wiped all their files from the computer. He's exposed online who the scammers are, and he's got access to, through that initial hacks, then got being able to hack into their kind of CCTV cameras in their control room.
Yeah.
And so causes real havoc. And you look at some other scam baiters, they've then, hacked their telephone system. So it only phones scam baiters. So it kind of wastes their time.
Yeah.
Or if they're receiving phone calls through some kind of pop-up ad, they load it with special software that just sends loads of telephone calls to their, which are all, a waste, and it kind of racks up their telephone bill. You've got other scam baiters who developed bots that, the scammers think they're talking to a victim, but it's actually a bot.
Yeah.
So there's a huge amount of potential disruption that could be undertaken.
Yes.
And if you kind of scale that up in law enforcement, as some of it is, obviously I watch a lot of it, some of it is, it does verge on, you start to be slightly squeamish about what they're doing, however bad the scammers are, in terms of like the humiliation of some of the scammers, and bordering perhaps sometimes on racism. And, the kind of really pushing some scammers to the absolute limits in terms of, I watched one a few weeks ago, and there's a guy, it's an Indian guy, and the scam baiter had got his access to his information. It's hacked his computer, and he had all his personal information on there. And they'd written to his parents and said, your son's a scammer. And then, he'd obviously been partying and taking drugs, and sent all these pictures to his parents.
And it's an interesting area, and it's something. Certainly, disruption is something that's quite close to my heart when I think about it, because a consistent picture that we see across lots of different threat areas is often the conversation is a bit like a whack-a-mole. you know, whether it's fraud, you know, and let's try and find this one, let's try and find that one, let's try and identify, you know, a lot of it's around detection. Let's just try and find it. Let's try and find it, detect it, whack it, done. Find it, detect it, whack it, done. That is not sustainable. You know, you just can't, you're going to lose that race because you can always, you know, surface another whack-a-mole in a different jurisdiction, in a different company, in a different guise. You know, you're fighting a losing battle. So therefore, you know, you have to think outside the box. And this is where, you know, we come back to the fact this is, I suppose, a bit of a loaded question because, you know, the only way that we can do that is you start to build out a bit of a richer intelligence picture. So the online YouTube organization, I suppose, is an example of this. But yeah, you don't really want to go after the single person sitting in the office in southern Nigeria. You want to go after the managers within that organization and hopefully identify them and, you know, get to some root cause and then disrupt the root cause. I'm not suggesting prosecute the root cause because, as you say, it's expensive. It takes time. But if you can shut down, you know, some of the more sort of strategic operations, that feels like a sensible strategy.
Yes, absolutely. And, you know, again, you look at what some of the scam pages exposed, you know, but here's, you know, Mr. X, he owns this company, here's his bank accounts, you know, here's a whole series of documents that they've managed to secure through hacking the scammers' computers. Now, obviously, law enforcement have significant challenges in doing that. You know, go into another country, hack computers, which is a criminal offence there, and you can understand, you know, why they don't. They don't do that. And, you know, obviously you gathered evidence in that way would never be admissible.
But we're not talking about admissibility at this point.
Exactly. We're talking about disruption. We're talking about things like, you know, if you've got that evidence there, you know, why can't you say, okay, if we've got any of this person's accounts, let's freeze them, you know, and get that, come and prove to us you're not making money, you know, through scams. You've got a legitimate business. Yeah. If they're a legitimate businessman, they will presumably come and do that. I mean, you know, should that person, you know, if they're, you know, running a scam center, you know, be allowed to kind of travel the world? You know, is there some means to kind of put a travel ban on them? Yeah. Because, you know, particularly a lot of these, the bigger players running these call centers, they travel the world. They like to do it. You know, you evidence for a lot of the scam pages videos, they'll hack into their computers and they'll put lots of pictures of nice holidays they've had. So,
and that's being intelligence led, isn't it? So if you're, you know, if you're finding these things, you're doing some open source research, you're joining the dots, as it were. Yeah, you can start to potentially make an impact here. Well, one thing, I don't know if you see this from your position, but we were chatting with Nick Sharp at the National Economic Crime Centre as part of this podcast series, and he gave quite an optimistic view on international collaboration, which I'd be interested to see if you see at all. You know, when I talked about, I said, oh, of course, you know, it must be a complete nightmare because you're dealing with regimes sometimes that are non-cooperative. We don't have any sort of, you know, pre-existing rules in which we engage. You know, it must be a haven. And what Nick came back to me on was actually sometimes, but actually fraud in particular, out of any particular crime type, because of the victims it affects. A lot of these governments are actually very motivated to collaborate because it's not seen as a, you know, like it's seen as a real crime that affects real people on the ground, as opposed to, say, money laundering, which can sometimes be a bit more, you know, you can't sort of spot the poor victim of fraud, you know. So are you seeing anything like that?
I definitely think it's a crime where countries are keen to cooperate. I think the challenge is the kind of resources in those countries that are dedicated to fraud. Because just like the UK, I mean, UK, you know, less than 3% police resources are dedicated to economic crime. And that's similar in most other countries. So even if you get good cooperation from Nigeria, India, those kinds of countries, you know, you're still dealing with a country where where fraud is, a low priority and with limited resources. So I think Nick is probably right. There is a lot of appetite for cooperation, and obviously then you take, like the Five Eyes and, Western Europe, absolutely. They'll this is like a no-brainer and very easy to cooperate on. But it's the end point of that cooperation. If you still want to kind of secure, arrests of lots of individuals, ultimately, particularly in places like Nigeria, there's so many fraudsters. It's, even though you get a very positive relationship with the EFCC, they still don't have the resources to catch a fraudster. So it's just the scale is so big that it's the challenge.
Do you think there's a link to the fact that basically what you're saying is that every jurisdiction, come what may, some have more or less resources, but when it comes to fraud, you have to prioritize. Obviously, you have to prioritize resources. There's far too much you could ever touch in 50 lifetimes as opposed to today.
Yes.
We know that much. So therefore, you've got to prioritize. What do you prioritize? Right, okay, well, you prioritize the organized criminal groups, the people, the groups that are, undertaking this at scale. So therefore, is that another reason why we're seeing more of this, the kind of nature of the West African activities we're seeing, which is a bit more grassroots? It's a bit less, it's a bit more decentralized. I know you talked about there is some element of organized criminal groups, but actually, is it a bit more organic? And therefore, it's much more difficult to tackle en masse because, there's not an obvious kingpin to go after, or at least there's not lots of obvious kingpins to go after.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a case for Nigeria. It's such a kind of mix of different sized organizations on on such a large scale. You could go after probably the top 10 groups, and that would still be a kind of very, very minor impact on the wider scale. So I think that's more difficult. I think, though, if you take the Southeast Asian scam compounds, which are kind of largely run by Chinese organized crime, they are quite large and, big operations. And so particularly, I think if you worked with China, which also, has an issue with these organizations because they target lots of Chinese citizens, and also they don't like alternative power sources like organized crime, which is a threat to the Communist Party, then I think you could probably have more effect on those types of centers, because they're so large, have an impact on that side.
Yeah, just to conclude then, we always ask our guests to look forward in a bit of crystal ball gazing, 10 years time. We should say 2030, but that feels too early now. But, how are things evolving? How do you see the nature of the threats in 5-10 years? And I know that's a difficult question, by the way. Yeah. And then how do we tackle it?
Yeah, that's really difficult. And I think fraud still will be a big problem, but it will probably be a different kind of problem. And the thing about fraudsters is they evolve, they develop new types of frauds, they use the latest technologies. And the other side, we create new systems to detect frauds. And so just take it, AI, AI fraudsters are using it for, developing videos, images, audio, etc. But of course, you can then utilize AI to detect all of those changes. And then you're going to kind of probably find new products that come on that can hide that. And then new products that come on that can find the hiding of the hiding, etc. So it will just be an arms race. And I think it will ultimately become, much more of a kind of, something that we just geared up to kind of expect and deal with, like pretty much we are now, sort of like your discussion of if you get a text message, from a courier, you think it's a fraudulent one. We're going to have lots of those different, those types of areas, where that will be the case. And, some fraudsters will have the edge. So, I have an app, tells me suspected scam, when my phone goes, or suspected telemarketer. Skilled fraudsters will find ways around that. And they will, seek to, exploit that. I think, obviously, the other kind of, if you look at the future, obviously, increasingly, we're doing so many more things online, through technology. And obviously, that opens up the risks of someone impersonating you and getting your access to your your passwords, your biometric information, etc. And I'm sure that sort of down the track, fraudsters will develop new ways of exploiting that, and then being able to impersonate individuals. And so you might think in some ways you're safer in the future because, probably like you, I have a fingerprint on my app to my bank every time. And I think no one's, even if my phone is stolen and it happened to be open, and they went onto my app, they wouldn't be able to kind of get into it because, they haven't got my finger. But, probably down the line, there will be some way to get around that.
Yeah, I think the thing that put this in the front of my mind was we did a podcast with a chap called Ian Smith, who is the commissioner of the Esports Integrity Coalition, which is, broadly speaking, the sort of governing body for esports. And he talked about it's basically this migration into the digital world that's going to happen over the next 10 years. And we are only very much at the beginning. And he gave the example of gamers who are, the first cohort of people who actually get more often, not always, but often get more fulfillment from their digital experience being jacked in, is the term that you might use, than the lived experience. So lived experience is actually, got to feed yourself. Oh God, that's a bit annoying before I have to jack myself back in. And that adoption of digital, especially with VR, especially with, with AI, it's just going to become, we're going to be spending more and more of our lives. Yeah. And it's a bit depressing to think about it in some ways, depending on your perspective. But for sure, we're going to be spending much more time online. So when you think about all these challenges that are being created through this digital world, they're only going to become so many more in terms of volume, because we will, in 10, 15, 20 years, be spending so much more time in digital worlds.
Yes.
That will be probably more pleasant than many of our lives.
Yes.
So it's just a breeding ground for an entrepreneurial fraudster.
Absolutely. So so there are types of frauds we probably can't even think of now that will emerge. But the digital world will open up lots of new opportunities, and there's always going to be fraudsters out there that will want to exploit them.
Exactly right. Well, listen, Mark, thank you very much for taking the time to speak to us. Very much enjoyed our conversation. Thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you very much.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Joining the Dots with me, Thomas Drone. We hope you found today's conversation practical and insightful. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review on your favourite podcast platform. It really helps us reach more listeners like you. Stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to uncover the stories of those on the front line of justice, harm reduction and global security. This is Thomas Drone, signing off. Thanks for listening.